First of all, we have Aleksandra Raspopina talking about international positioning through media, focusing on RT. And then we have Carolijn van Noort from the University of the West of Scotland talking about the strategic narratives of roads in China's broadcasting of the BRI. And finally, we have precious Chatterje-Doody, who's, by the way, co-convener of this working group, and Lucy Birge, University of Manchester, talking on Russian public diplomacy. So I think you'll agree that that spans, a very interesting array of different perspectives and approaches. So I think if the participants agree, we'll probably just stick to the running order, which means that we would begin with Aleksandra Raspopina. Alexandra, are you happy to begin the proceedings?
Hi, yes.
Thank you, Sasha. Sorry, Sasha. Yeah, you like to be known as Sasha or?
Yeah, I mean, Alexandra just sounds like I'm in trouble.
Oh, yeah. Okay, thank you, Sasha. And as I said, they'll each talk for about 10 minutes, which means that we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So thank you.
So I didn't realize I was going to be first, but hi, everyone. So I'm doing an experiment. I'm going to try to do this without any slides, because I had this feeling that people zone out when they look at a PowerPoint and just a disembodied voice with an accent somewhere behind it. So I guess if people zone out now, it would be my fault entirely. So I'm going to talk about international positioning through media, and in particular about how RT defines and explains Russia's role in world politics. And first, I'm going to briefly explain why I'm even looking at RT to provide any understanding of Russia's role in international relations. And then I'm going to talk about my findings about how RT describes Russia, how it presents it, and how it explains it to the audiences. And before I start, I feel like many people on this in this event would probably know it, but I think it's worth repeating just so we're all on the same page. RT doesn't actually cover Russia that much unless there's a big event going on. So it did actually, when the channel just launched back in 2005, it did focus on covering Russia for international audiences. But as the editor Margarita Simonyan has explained in many interviews, they quickly realized there is very little demand for that for a channel that just exclusively covers news from a specific foreign country. So in this paper, what I'm doing is I'm looking for speckles and crumbs of discussions of Russia in RT's coverage of world affairs. And actually, I think there's an argument for this approach, because we get to see this idea of Russia integrated in international coverage rather than sort of presented in a vacuum of Russia-specific coverage. And in particular, I looked at conflict coverage of wars in Ukraine and in Syria, both in Russian and in English. So I looked at website content because RT doesn't broadcast in Russian. And I used quantitative content analysis and textual analysis to study articles published by RT, and I also did a document analysis of some of Russia's foreign policy documents. And this particular paper is a part of my PhD, which looks at RT coverage and Russian foreign policy agenda more widely, so I'm not only looking at Russia. So why am I even looking at how RT presents and describes Russia? I do it because RT, as an international broadcaster, is a crucial actor of Russian public diplomacy. And I could talk here for a very long time about how many Russian foreign policy documents talk of the importance of soft power and public diplomacy for Russia, but I don't have a lot of time to talk, thankfully, about that. So I will summarize what they're saying. First, they say that being able to spread and control information about Russia is seen as very important for the country, on the same level as having military power. Second, from documents from before RT was founded, and actually after it was founded as well, point out that Russia is behind other countries in terms of being able to project its views to the world. And international media also don't portray it fairly either, according to Russia. So the documents argue that Russia needs to get better at using information means such as media in order to explain its positions and policies to the world and defend itself against what it perceives to be misinformation and propaganda. So when RT launched in 2005, it was seen as an essential tool of spreading information about Russia, and also as a defense tool, for the lack of a better word, against what Russia perceives to be untrue or harmful information. And actually, Margarita Simonyan, the editor-in-chief of RT, actually compared RT to the Ministry of Defense in one of her interviews, which I think is not subtle at all, but is very telling and good for my study particularly. And further, of course, people would know that on their About Us page, RT actually explains that one of their missions is to acquaint international audiences with a Russian viewpoint on major global events. So I'm looking at how RT talks about Russia, because RT is an important actor in Russian public diplomacy, and it actually promises to deliver a Russian viewpoint on major global events. So in a way, what I'm asking is, what is the Russian viewpoint on Russia in global politics? Well, what does RT say about Russia? First of all, I looked at words that are used to describe Russia. So this is something that I looked for quantitatively. This would be adjectives, for example, that are used to describe the country in general. When I talk about descriptions of Russia, I of course mean descriptions of the country, descriptions of country's official, politicians, Russians as people. So whenever I say descriptions of Russia, I mean all of those things combined. And when I presented this part of my research at my department, I like to ask the audience what they think the most common words that RT uses to describe Russia are. And from the answers, you can discover a lot about preconceptions that people have about RT, particularly in a journalism department. And the single most popular word that is used to describe Russia is actually Russian. So this is, of course, used to refer to officials and politicians. For example, if they're saying Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs said this and this. And to make it even more disappointing for people who were hoping for something colorful and propagandistic, the absolute majority of texts don't actually have a description at all. So I think it's about 96% in the Ukrainian sample, and slightly less, about 94% in my Syrian sample are the texts that where there aren't any adjectives that describe Russia. So by itself, this information probably doesn't give us much to analyze, apart from the fact that there's nothing there. However, I also looked at descriptions of other countries, and there are descriptions of other countries in the text. So if we look at RT texts quantitatively, without looking at how Russia is presented in the structure of the text, not qualitatively, we might say that Russia is a rather sort of faceless presence, that no descriptive words apply to. And at the same time, I want to stress that it is a presence. So I wanted to show you a table. This is, I can share my screen, right? It's only the third column that I want. So when I say presence, I actually mean presence. So these are the actors that get quoted or mentioned. So Q stands for quoted and M stands for mentioned. So these are the actors that are present in RT coverage. And as we can see, it's not a tiny amount. So I'm just going to stop sharing this for a second. So this leads me to another point. So who are these people who represent Russia? And the brief answer to this would be officials. It's Putin, Peskov, Sergei Lavrov, Maria Zakharova, and other government and army officials. They are the most quoted actors, and they're all obviously officials. And even if we look at the category that I called other, so this would be people who didn't fit into any of the official categories that I prescribed, most of those people, the absolute majority, would be journalists, Russian experts, Russian academics, and former politicians, for example, Gorbachev. So it's not particularly an non-elite interview sources either. And in a textual analysis, I tried to fill in these gaps that I identified with content analysis, that the limitations of quantitative methods couldn't fill. And so I studied the same text qualitatively. So I just selected a longer text from my original quantitative sample. And what I found is that the way RT presents Russia corresponds to Russian foreign policy agenda. On what levels? First of all, There is the idea of Russia as an upholder of international law. I hope that is the word, upholder, that is prevalent in pretty much all of the foreign policy documents that describe Russia and in RT. Then there is the idea of Russia as an objective arbiter of international relations. Russia that plays this role where it has to remind Western politicians about the laws and norms, about international laws. And this is something that is very widespread actually in RT coverage. And actually, this exact verb, remind, in Russian it would be napomnio, is used to actually refer, for example, in a headline, it would be Russia's UN ambassador reminded American UN ambassador of the American Constitution, or something like this. And I feel like I'm slowly running out of time, so I'm going to try to conclude fast. So RT presents Russia in a way that is consistent with the Russian foreign policy agenda. But what I found slightly more interesting are the things that are actually missing from the way Russia is presented. So how Russia is not presented, especially comparing to other countries, and in particular not Ukraine and Syria, because understandably they would be the centers of action in my sample. So it wouldn't be fair to say they're described more than Russia. But for example, European and Western countries that are presented that are compared to Russia. So I think one of the interesting ways that Russia is not presented is regular people. So Russia's officials, politicians, army people, and the farthest it gets from officials is still academics and experts and Russian journalists. And on the levels of individuals, civilians are only ever present as crowds. So for example, at the Crimea Welcome to Russia rallies that were widely covered in RT. And Russia is also not presented as having any sort of internal political dialogue, which I thought was very interesting. And I'm not talking about internal politics, I'm talking about internal political dialogue about international issues. There aren't any signs of discussion. For example, in coverage of Western countries, there are texts often touch on how disagreements inside the country affect international relations. So for example, in coverage of America, there's quite a lot of coverage of how disagreements between Democrats and the Republicans and various lobby groups affect how America, for example, applies sanctions to other countries, or how America behaves in Syria. Similarly, in the UK, there's coverage of how Jeremy Corbyn's views, for example, on international affairs really differ from the Tory views. And Russia appears as this sort of united front when it comes to politics. And this was a very rushed conclusion, sorry. Thank you for attention. I hope, am I okay for time?
Yeah. All good, all good. In fact, you adhered beautifully to the time limit. Almost perfectly. So thank you, and sorry if you felt you had to rush a bit. I'm hoping that we're going to be able to tease out some of the more salient points of your presentation in the discussion. So now we're going to move on to Carolijn van Noort, who's looking at the Belt and Road and visualizations of the Belt and Road. So Carolijn, if you're ready, please.
Of course, I will share a screen.
Great.
Is that all looking good?
Yeah, perfect.
All right, excellent. All right, good afternoon. I'm very excited to be presenting in this panel. I'd like to talk to you about research that I've been developing over the last few years. I've been particularly looking at how rising powers communicate about infrastructure and international relations. And recently I've been developing a new book about specifically focusing on infrastructure communication by China, about the Belt and Road Initiative. So one of the chapters that I like to present to you today is focusing on China-Kyrgyzstan relations. So, and particularly on one partially branded BRI infrastructure project, which is called the Alternative North-South Road. So I've been looking at various, in this book, I'm looking at various infrastructure projects that are branded under the umbrella of the Belt and Road. Some are heavily celebrated or talked about in the news, such as the Standard Gauge Railway in Kenya. But there are many that are kind of going under the radar, that actually are a little bit, there's a bit of ambiguity around the branding. In some way it's a BRI project, in another way it's just a China-backed infrastructure. So why am I looking at this particular road that perhaps some of you have never heard of? I find it interesting to explore the consistency of China's communication of infrastructure projects across. So in some ways, I'm also obviously comparing it with other countries. So in the chapter that I've been developing, obviously I first situate the context. I'm looking at China-Kyrgyzstan relations, which have entered a new chapter in the last decade. There's been a lot of agreements, documents signed. So I won't go into much detail, but I'd like to talk to you about China's communication of a particular infrastructure project. So here I'm looking at the visuals, the visuality, the link between visuality and infrastructure. And I'm showing you here a screenshot by China Xinhua News that they post on Twitter. And there's an embedded video that they also share on Facebook and on YouTube. And here China is talking about this specific road project in Kyrgyzstan. Sometimes it's called the alternative North-South road, but also the North-South alternative road. And here they use the hashtag of Belt and Road. So that's quite interesting, even though the video itself does not mention Belt and Road. So in other words, there's a bit of ambiguity. Now, why am I looking in particular at Kyrgyzstan case when it comes to infrastructure is quite important. So I put up some quotes here to situate the chapter. On the top, you see a quote that that was presented in a document that was created last year during the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing, where participants who attended said that they together support policies and activities that help landlocked countries to transform into land-linked ones, including by strengthening connectivity and cooperation on transit arrangements and infrastructure. So clearly, Kyrgyzstan is a landlocked country and has a great ambition to become land-linked. You see this also in the development of other kind of strategies, such as the road sector, road sector strategy that has been developed since 2015, and other strategic partnership agreements with China. And so on the bottom, I cited the Kyrgyzstan's president, where he talks specifically about this road that I'm looking at, that it says that the construction of an alternative road is of great importance in strengthening the transport independence of the country. In the future, the road will be the impetus for the development of the economy. So here you see how road development is economically rationalized. Now, in terms of this alternative North-South road, it was quite a lot of research and trying to figure out and get my head around about all the dimensions about what was happening on the ground. It is a 433-kilometer road that is split up in 3 phases. China is involved in the first 2 phases in terms of the funding, providing a concessional loan, as well as in terms of as a contractor, China Road and Bridge Corporation is involved. The third phase is the Asian Development Bank is involved. Now on the right side, you see how this road is split up in a lot of different sections, and those sections are attributed to different donors. No, it's pretty small, but this picture actually comes from Kuhrt, which is stands for Central Asian Regional Economic Cooperation. And it's quite interesting that the particular phases are also linked up with Kuhrt corridors. And Kuhrt corridors is that their aim is to promote development. Kuhrt together they promote the development of corridor infrastructures to improve people mobility and to increase trade specifically with countries outside the region. So I think it's important to realize that obviously China is an important actor, but in terms of road development, there's many other actors, so a lot of the infrastructure is linked. In addition, my focus on this particular road, there's lots of other things happening, particularly railway and other type of road construction. So in terms of the theoretical framework that I'm using for my entire book, but also particularly looking at this chapter, I'm using the work of strategic narratives, as I've done previously. And then I'm very engaged in trying to use an interdisciplinary approach, or in other words, like using theories from international political communication and then being in conversation with other theories, particularly from the science and technology and anthropology areas, where there's been really great papers where they conceptualize and theorize infrastructure as technologies of modernity. So lots of different ways of thinking about infrastructure, and I'm trying to relate that and connect that into my framework. And given that I'm looking at visuals, obviously, I'm connecting that also to the work of Blijker, Ronald Blijker, about visual politics. I'm obviously conscious of my time. Just wanted to show some images that I've been analyzing using a visual analysis approach. Here, this video, we see some screenshots, and I thought it was quite interesting in terms of the alternative North-South road that in terms of the formation projection of this infrastructure narrative is that they're using a lot of explosions and images of construction material or equipment. And in many ways, there's this sense of taming the environment. Now, you could say, well, you know, to make a road or to build a road, you need to have this in place. But it's a choice to show the process, instead of, for example, using testimonies by, say, local people that are actually reaping the benefit, the social anticipated economic benefits. So it depends on what you want to show, to say it's an infrastructure success and this is what we want to show. So I thought it's interesting how they wanted to show and focus on these particular explosions. And second, in terms of these videos, you see a lot of focus on standardization, and here there's a lot of emphasis on making the road very flat and monitoring the top layer. And so in many ways, I see this as linked to China's attempt to be seen and to push this image as being seen as a infrastructure and standard setting power. So there's this connection between imagery and identity, a narrative, or the pursuit of wanting to be seen and recognized in that sense in international affairs. And lastly, some of the imagery as well is about who is legitimizing this narrative on behalf of China. And although some of the videos will show Chinese, say, managerial persons of the China Road and Bridge Corporation, you see also interviews with decision makers within Kyrgyzstan that speak on behalf of China and talk about anticipated benefits, and these are particularly in the economic modalities of looking at anticipated economic benefits, as well as linking as in a spatial way. So this idea that the country will be better connected between the northern regions and the southern ones. So just to say a couple of last few points is saying that in terms of Kyrgyzstan's north-south alternative road and China's communication thereof, I thought it was quite interesting how China communicates in some way, in a similar way, in a systematic way across different infrastructures in similar ways, where it focuses on good standards, on these economic benefits, but there's also differences when it comes to this technological modality, when this is very much like an infrastructure intervention, and this idea that those Tianjin mountains, those massive mountains that normally separated, well, still separate China and Kyrgyzstan, now are seen, these mountains are now seen as they are a bridge now, so they can be dealt with, given the technological power or standard setting power that China now has. So I thought it was interesting. So anyways, this ongoing research hopefully to be completed later this year, and I'm looking forward to hear your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolijn. Fascinating research there on the BRI. And then our final panelist or panelists, Precious Chatterje-Doody and Lucy Birge. I'm not sure if I've pronounced that right. Forgive me if I haven't. Precious, will you and Lucy both be presenting?
No, I'm going to present, but Lucy's here, so she's going to be available for the question and answer session.
Okay, great. Did I pronounce her name correctly?
Yeah, perfect.
I'm not sure. Okay, good. Great. So if you want to fire away then,
Sure.
and then that we'll move on to the Q&A. Lovely.
Okay, thanks, Natasha. So this paper is on Russian public diplomacy in uncertain times, co-authored with Lucy Birge, as Natasha said, and it's for a volume edited by Pavel Sorovic and Ilan Mana on public diplomacy and the politics of uncertainty. And actually, Russian public diplomacy, I think, is a really interesting in the media, precisely because of some of the specifics of how Russian international broadcasters operate. So I'm going to be talking about RT, formerly Russia Today, and Sputnik, and essentially their brand identities and their outputs are fairly ideally suited to this kind of environment. And we illustrate this by looking at the empirical case of the Skripal poisonings in March 2018 in Salisbury, which very quickly the UK determined that Russia was highly likely responsible for, and which RT and Sputnik then had to kind of spin for international audiences. And we could see this essentially as part of a broader credibility competition between the UK and Russian governments to kind of set the narrative of what had happened for other governments as they were coordinating diplomatic action, also for international organisations and for the broader public. And a really important thing to notice straight away is that the investigation into the poisonings would, as it took place, all of the information or most of the information was largely classified as it was taking place. And this really influenced how that played out. So in this low information environment, RT and Sputnik were very much, you could say, at the vanguard of putting forward the Russian perspective on what had happened. So in examining their reporting, we kind of see how Russian public diplomacy can actually thrive in certain circumstances where you have low information and where there is inherent uncertainty. However, actually going on to manage that process in today's interactive global media environment is actually very, very far from a simple thing. And just to give you a bit of the strategic context for this, now Sasha really helpfully outlined some of the broader kind of strategic elements, which means I can kind of skip over some of those, so thank you. But basically you could say that since, you know, the very start of when Putin first acceded to the Russian presidency in 2000, public diplomacy has very much been intertwined with ideas of information security for Russia. So straight away, information security was named in the military doctrine of 2000 and then expanded in its own strategic doctrine the same year. There's been various iterations over time in specific doctrines and through broader strategic documentation, but largely you can say that as well as the technical concerns that you associate with information security, Russia has always kind of parceled in with that disinformation. So over time into a securitized notion of concerns about how non-Russian international broadcasters have portrayed Russia in international affairs. So you can see the foundation of RT, then Russia Today in 2005, and Sputnik in 2014, very much as part of a Russian strategic response to perceived information security threats from the West in this broader age of political and media uncertainty. And certainly with the rebranding of Russia Today as RT in 2009, which was very much a response to international media's negative portrayals of what had happened the previous year in Georgia, then you can very much see how this kind of machinery was set up to offer an alternative, and very much informed by these kind of securitized concerns. And it was at that point where RT, which had been, you know, a touchy-feely soft power kind of outlet at first, really clearly transformed into this counter-hegemonic voice under the question more mantra. And in that way, it had some similarities to things like Telesur, Al Jazeera, Press TV, these other sort of counter-hegemonic alternatives to Western mainstream media that were appearing over that same sort of period. Sputnik, right from its foundation in 2014, had this same kind of counter-hegemonic ethos. So its motto is telling the untold, so stories you wouldn't hear or perspectives you wouldn't hear ordinarily. And where RT has produced content in English, Spanish, German, Arabic, and French, Sputnik kind of expanded on all of those languages, adding radio services in them and several more languages, plus web content in over 30 languages. So a kind of broad, kind of throwing a lot of information out there in a lot of languages. And as I'm sure you're all aware of, the content tends to be pretty critical of Western liberal democracies, and often intimating that there is some sort of collusion between Western mainstream media and politicians to hide some of the pathologies of the systems that they operate within. Now, in the particular study that we did for the Skripal case, we focused on English language output for various reasons, but including the importance of the UK-Russia dynamic in that case. We were looking at web news and tweets from RT and Sputnik, the daily news bulletins of RT, and episodes of relevant regular programmes for RT and Sputnik that were dedicated to discussing the Skripal case. We used a form of audiovisual narrative analysis, so specifically looking at what actors were presented as being important in events, what voices were platformed, what kind of construction of Russia you saw in that reporting, and what sort of interrelationship between the two public diplomacy outlets and other actors was revealed in the ways in which that reporting was constructed, as well as how they went on to manage uncertainty both in the case itself and in the ways in which they were reporting. Things that came out for us was that there's an extremely complex interrelationship between these two international broadcasters and other influential players, where you see a kind of co-construction of key narratives using voices from ministries, embassies, external commentators, etc., all kind of parceled up into some kind of broader vision. Now, to talk about the specifics, we looked at three parts of the case as it was reported: the breaking of the poisoning news, the point when the two suspects were interviewed on RT, ostensibly as an exclusive of their own free volition, wanting to talk to the media, and then what we've called the epilogue period, where it was reported pretty much after the culmination of the key parts of the case had transpired. And it was pretty interesting, really, because in the very early period, the breaking of the story, both RT and Sputnik had a fairly closely coordinated approach to that news, and it was focused around this idea of media centricity. So rather than reporting what had happened, they were reporting how what had happened was being reported in the Western media. So there was a lot of quoting of UK media, a lot of criticism for its speculating before all of the facts were in, comparisons to spy novels of the past, indicating that perhaps something wasn't entirely true to reality in this, and using a lot of sampling of social media as a sort of proxy for public opinion that was questioning the initial narratives coming about around the poisoning, and also using analysts who would talk about past conspiracies of Western governments to sort of intimate that perhaps the official government line wasn't to be trusted in this case. Now, when it came to the interview with the two suspects later that year, well, at first, both RT and Sputnik really aggressively promoted it, but very quickly after that hit the air, it became clear that nobody believed the story given by these two clearly GRU officers who were saying that they were just tourists in Salisbury. And so dealing with the kind of negative backlash of that, you saw a kind of split in how RT and Sputnik went about that, bearing in mind that this appeared on RT, and in a way it really spoke directly to the credibility of that network and its story that this was just a featured interview rather than some sort of state collusion. And so RT ended up mainly focusing on the furore around the interview, by talking about the angry politicians' responses in the UK, or featuring kind of public comedy responses that had been memes across social media, etc., rather than dealing with the substance of the criticisms or disbelief about the interview. Sputnik in the UK completely sidestepped it, barely covered it at all, whereas the the US Sputnik outputs tended to overanalyze it, almost kind of justifying what the official line was about it through this over-analytical approach, deconstructing what had happened in the interview. And it kind of revealed a pretty clear failure to effectively address the uncertainty around, I think, that interview and how it had been received, the unanticipated wholesale negative response, kind of demonstrating that the Russian approach to public diplomacy is very good when you're raising questions, very effective at doing that. It's much less effective at providing any sort of clear counter narrative or clear answers to those questions. And so that was really a problem. It was really strenuously avoided. Then when it came to the sort of epilogue of the case, now this is something that kind of returned to the news cycle in dribs and drabs as things made it more newsworthy. So for example, when a Novichok themed product was created, or when the BBC announced it was going to be producing a Salisbury poisonings programme, then things like that would kind of set off a little bit of reporting again on RT and Sputnik. And again, here they return to that first mode of media-centric reporting, where the reporting was about what was being said rather than actually saying anything particularly substantive. Until it came to the anniversary of the poisonings, where RT and Sputnik both started talking about the unanswered questions that remained, that showed serious problems with the British official account. And in that, they were directly kind of quoting from a list of unanswered questions that had been published by the embassy to mark that anniversary. For RT, they just faithfully reported the questions the embassy had raised, Sputnik went a bit further and sort of insinuated some sort of UK government complicity in the poisoning. And so to conclude very briefly, because I know I'm kind of close on time, I think that given that the Russian public diplomacy strategy is very much security focused, the kind of political uncertainty that surrounds highly securitized events such as this poisoning gives very good opportunity for that machine to kind of kick off, to start working, to thrive, and to capitalize on the low public information about these kind of events and the high public mistrust around them and around the sources reporting them. So both RT and Sputnik use this media centricity to take audiences' attention away from events towards their mediation, and this was when they were most coherent in raising questions or inconsistencies or even charges of Russophobia. But when there is high or specific information, such as when the two suspects were identified and outed essentially as being GRU agents, that's when it really falters. So it works much less effectively because it can't really deal directly with specifics and tries instead to neutralize them maybe with humor or pop culture references, or kind of just humorous reporting essentially, to avoid any sort of substantive engagement. And so I think this is when it works much less effectively. And I would say that the kind of multifaceted, non-linear media environment is really a key vulnerability for Russian public diplomacy efforts, because you simply can't just effectively manage those narratives from the top down. And interestingly enough, shortly after this, Moscow State University started using the Skripal case as an example in one of its communication courses about Russian failure in the face of a hostile UK media campaign. So I think this speaks very much to the impossibility of a kind of predictably effective management of public opinion using those public diplomacy outlets. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Precious. Very interesting. And I think all of these papers in some way do connect and perhaps overlap at times as well. Obviously all focusing on public diplomacy to a lesser or greater extent, and also the way in which public diplomacy can kind of be used for disinformation purposes. So thank you to all of you. Now we're going to have the Q&A session now. Luckily we have quite a bit of time left, but we will be finishing on time at 3:30. So can I ask if anyone has a question, can they please ideally use the raise your hand function, but if for any reason you're unable to do that, you can ask a question in the chat, and then I'll be able to see, I'll be able to see everybody's questions appearing in the chat, or I will see if you have a raised hand. Okay, anybody? I'm looking through. I'm not seeing any questions so far. Perhaps people are still gathering their thoughts. Okay. Ah, there's a question here. Can I ask that those who ask the question, unless they really don't want to, could they turn on their camera?
Sorry, I can introduce myself. I'd rather not turn camera because of, was not really expecting it.
Oh, that's fine.
Yeah, but let me introduce myself. My name is Irina Neustrova, and I'm a PhD research student with the University of East Anglia.
Okay.
And I'm actually doing a research on the linguistic means of misrepresentation of economic data in Russian official discourse, which is quite similar to the topic of today's presentations. So I was actually wondering, because I believe that what Sasha is doing is quite close to what I'm planning to do. So I'm actually quite interested, and the question is about, because she mentioned she was doing quite a lot of qualitative research apparently on her corpus of data, but then she mentioned that she was running some qualitative analysis. I was just wondering, what are the methodologies that she kind of employed for qualitative analysis, because whether they are purely linguistic or whether they are just, considering what's behind it, or, well, just out of curiosity, because I'm doing roughly the same, but I'm kind of following a very strict linguistic framework.
Okay.
So it is done from a linguistic standpoint. So I'm just interested in what qualitative is.
The methodology, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so Sasha, would you be happy to answer that question now?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. So I'm doing a quantitative content analysis, and I'm doing a textual analysis. And the reason I'm doing a textual analysis is because I don't want to look at the text, RT content that I'm studying as just a text. I'm at the journalism department, so quite a lot of what I'm looking at is this sort of, I'm trying to think about editorial decisions that went into producing something, just the journalistic structures of text and things like that I wouldn't be able to look at just looking at it purely linguistically. I hope I answered the question.
Well, to a certain extent, yes. So you're not looking at, well, presumably you're looking at context, right? But, and trying to figure out from the entire text what was the intent, right? For writing, actually, what was the editorial intent, but you're not doing it from the linguistic perspective. Am I right?
Well, I mean, I'm looking at Russian and English, and I feel like quite a lot of looking at sort of intent and foreign policy implications, they do include looking at language, because language informs how people perceive it. So I am looking at language, but not as a linguist, because I'm not one.
Fair enough.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, I hope that answered your question. I'm sure you two could, communicate.
Well, I'm happy. I do keep my niche then. Thank you.
Oh, okay, good. You felt threatened, and now you feel reassured. Great.
Thank you.
Okay, now I have a few questions that have come up in the chat, starting with Jade McGlynn. And I know that Jade is here. She did have her camera on. Jade, would you like me to just read out the question, or you can read out the question yourself? It's up to you.
Please could you read out, just because I have a baby next to me who I feel.
Oh, okay. That's a very good excuse. Well, I'm quite impressed that baby is lying there quietly for now anyway. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to read out Jade's question, which is also to Sasha. Now, Jade says in her PhD, she included case studies on domestic state-aligned media coverage of the Ukraine and Syria conflict. Sasha, I'm sure you can read it yourself. But in the Ukraine coverage, Russia's actions and relationship to the international order were framed as defensive, i.e. Russia under attack or being a victim of the unfair global order and so on. Whereas in the Syria coverage, the framing was of Russia being on the offensive, restoring post-Yalta order, sorting out the mess caused by the meddling of the US. Did you find that that was replicated in RT coverage in English or not?
In a way, yes. Consider in reference to Ukraine and the defensive, there's definitely that same. So when I looked at how people in Crimea and how people in Eastern Ukraine are described, one of the widespread descriptors is Russian speaking. So all of these people who aren't Russia, or sometimes they are just described as like strict Russian. So and it's not clear. I guess in Russian they're using the word Ruski, which specifies ethnicity, not sort of civic relationship with Russia. And there is definite sort of inclusion of those people into the Russia category, and then protecting them becomes a defensive mechanism. And of course, that is also connected with how Ukraine is presented as run by Nazis. But also at the same time, I think this sort of offensive idea, or the idea of Russia on the offensive as sort of like resisting the US meddling, it's still present in the Ukrainian coverage as far as I looked at RT, because the Euromaidan protests and everything that ensued, the new government in Ukraine, they're still presented as sort of being puppeteered by the West. So the idea of the US meddling is still very much there in the coverage of Ukraine. And I was quite surprised by the coverage of Syria that I looked. There's definitely that idea of protecting, restoring, and Russia as a protector, but it's a lot less emotional than in Ukraine. I was surprised that, and there's a lot less coverage as well. So I had to keep adding more and more events to my timeline of Syria to just sort of have comparable sample sizes for Ukraine and Russia, which I thought was very interesting. So the idea of Russia being on the offensive, it's actually a lot less emotional and a lot sort of less involved than the coverage of Ukraine.
Yeah, very interesting actually, that question. Thank you, Sasha. And now we have a question for Precious and Lucy from Ayjan Shashonova. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, I apologize. So you're asking, in the comparative analysis of RT and Sputnik, did you get a feeling that one of them is targeted at the Western or global audience, i.e. RT, while the other one, Sputnik, is directed at the near abroad or the former Soviet states? Precious and Lucy, are you able to answer that?
Hi, is my audio coming through okay?
Yeah, fine.
Okay. So bearing in mind that for this particular study, we were focusing on the English language output rather than doing a span across the languages. Now, what I would say is that for both RT and Sputnik, it doesn't make sense to assume that English language output is primarily addressed towards English as a first. Now you can see in the different language operations for both of them, they're far more targeted towards those specific audiences that you would expect from the languages. That's not the case so much with the English language output, I don't think. I don't know if Lucy can join us.
Hi, yeah, I'm here, sorry.
Hey.
Yeah, no, I would just
Is there
corroborate.
anything else? Sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to echo what Precious said, which is that the English language content, it's not so much, you do get localized content that is sort of tailored specifically to UK and US audiences, but certainly with this issue, and certainly the bulk of the English language content in Sputnik is oriented at a sort of international English-speaking audience. So that doesn't necessarily mean that nationality is a factor there. But certainly when it comes to the Russian language presentations in Sputnik, that is directed at audiences from the near abroad who are obviously Russian-speaking. So yeah, there is a lot of that.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And are they very different? I mean, presumably they are very different in content.
Yeah, completely different.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Good. And now Ankur Shah has a question with his virtual hand raised. I can't see a hand raised, but Ankur, would you like to turn on your camera or answer your ask a question?
Sure.
Yeah, I think you've unmuted. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you all for the really interesting presentation. So I'm a postgraduate student in PKU in Beijing, and I research China-Russia relations. I actually do a lot of research on the BRI, but my question is not on that today.
Okay.
But I know you sort of separately addressed Chinese and Russian media strategies. I would be really interested in knowing if anyone has any thoughts on kind of to what extent Russia and China actually coordinate their media strategies, and then specifically on disinformation. So I know that MOUs have been signed between Sputnik or RT and sort of respective Chinese state entities, but is there actually a coherent level of coordination at play? There's been a lot made during COVID about China borrowing Russian disinformation techniques. So I guess to what extent do you think this is the case? Or are Russian and Chinese disinformation techniques actually very different? Thank you.
Guess any of you could answer, whoever feels in the best position to answer, or all of you can answer.
Maybe I'll make a small start. I'm sure Caroline's got things to say about this one as well. So Carolijn and I have been working on a separate paper about Russian-Chinese media cooperation around the Belt and Road Initiative. And one of the very interesting things about this is that there's been kind of long lead into these various initiatives that we're seeing more recently. And there's been kind of various sort of annual media fora and the idea of kind of Russian-Chinese collaborative events and kind of press collaboration type things. But a lot of these have built on already existing Chinese programs. So in what we have been looking at the Belt and Road Initiative in particular, we have seen a sort of collaborative, so an attempt to create collaborative media outputs based around essentially very soft introductions to China's vision of the Belt and Road. So allowing Russian journalists and Chinese journalists to collaborate together on a big, long press junket, essentially looking at the Chinese territory of some of the kind of, they call this the New Silk Road, and then to kind of cascade press outputs as a result of this cultural jolly, essentially. But what ended up being produced as a result of that was something that corresponded very closely with Chinese visions for this New Silk Road project, corresponded almost not at all with Russian visions of kind of regional integration, and essentially kind of replicated the kind of soft messaging that China had been pursuing individually, and ended up looking a lot like a sort of paid advertorial, I suppose. So this is, you know, there are lots of these kind of formal collaborations, but they appear to be very asymmetric in the nature in which they actually play out.
Mm-hmm.
Have I missed anything, Caroline?
No, I think you said that really well when it comes to this, you know, explaining this idea, what's been happening in terms of media collaboration. And, you know, in terms of the content, it definitely reinforces narratives that China broadcasts individually, you know, by CGTN or Xinhua itself. So in that sense, it's quite strategic to, you know, invite Russian journalists to come on this all expense paid trip through beautiful places in China and speak on behalf of China how great it is. So it reaches back to these old strategies, this idea that the foreign can work on behalf of China, because it almost like it further legitimizes the narrative. So it's quite interesting. In many ways, it repeats itself. So when I'm looking at my chapter and what we've been working on together, it's quite interesting how similar it is, and in many ways it kind of complicates Russia's benefit in that in that collaboration. Yeah, there is obviously benefits, but perhaps it's quite asymmetric, as Precious explained.
Yeah, could I just really briefly say on that point, I think it's very important for Russia to be seen as an equal partner in this kind of greater Eurasian partnership, which in theory signals the coming together of the Eurasian Economic Union and the BRI. You know, obviously we'll see about that, but it is very important for Russia to have that narrative, whereas what you are telling us seems to reinforce the idea of, you know, Russia as a kind of junior partner hanging on China's coattails.
Yeah, I would say on that as well, Natasha, there's this kind of formal idea of equality. So there's the kind of repetition of the idea that now things are very special, now we have a special partnership. And there's this reiteration of the idea and ideal of a genuine equal partnership, but actually what the strategic vision that you see, despite those kind of trimmings that insinuate it is more of an equal partnership, the actual strategic vision that you see corresponds almost exactly with the pre-existing Chinese strategic vision rather than the Russian one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
very interesting. Sasha, did you want to come in on anything?
No, not on this topic, but my raised hand is a question. So,
sorry. Okay, great. Yeah, did any of the panelists have any questions to each other, actually?
Yeah, I do. So my question is for Precious and Lucy, and you made this really great point about Russian public diplomacy thriving in low information environments, and this is something that I've seen in the coverage that I looked at in relation to MH17 and to the chemical attack in Han Shihun in Syria, where there's lots of different narratives that aren't actually Russian viewpoint on major global events, as they say, because they're just all over the place. It can't be, they all can't be like a Russian viewpoint on major global events. And but you made this, you said that after the interview was broadcast with the Skripal poisoners, that they sort of left all those theories behind, if I understood correctly what you were saying, that they stopped pushing all the alternative narratives. And I was wondering if you had any insights. So they, with MH17, they didn't stop pushing all the alternative narratives. And even still now, with all the new developments, with actual charges being brought against Russian citizens, it seems like RT coverage is still very much pushing the same things that they were talking about 7 years ago when it actually happened. I was wondering if you had any sort of insight into that, or if that's completely off.
Yeah, I think perhaps I wasn't quite clear in how I articulated that. So it wasn't the case that suddenly those counter narratives stopped appearing. It was that in the reporting of that specific development, in the reporting of the of the interview and of the public responses to that, then it almost became emptied out. The reporting of that interview became almost emptied out. So then, you know, when there was a very negative public reception of that, very negative public responses to that, but the actual substance of why people reacted negatively, so implausibility of the narrative, say, then RT didn't engage with. For instance, it just sort of talked about, oh, haha, these memes that have looked, oh, no one knows what's going on, isn't it funny, rather than, you know, something's really up with this narrative, something's really up with the Russian government position. You know, it was just kind of made light of. And then, you know, on Sputnik there was this weird disjoint between the UK outputs kind of not wanting to talk about the interview at all, still talking about the case, but just refused to talk about the interview at all, whereas US Sputnik kind of overanalyzed it to the extent that they were almost trying to show how, no, this definitely could be legitimate, something might be up, but we don't know what's up. And it was a lot of different narratives, like you say, but I think, as I said earlier, you can have all these different narratives that theoretically might make sense from a Russian perspective. They don't have to hang together as part of any overall coherent counter-narrative, and that's kind of the reason, or that explains where and when you get a sort of thriving public diplomacy operation and not, is that when it can be all about just questions and pointing out inconsistencies, that can be done quite effectively without any obvious problem. But if you try and patch those narratives together to say something substantive, that's when it all falls apart. And I think with the suspect's interview, there was a very clear insinuation that was being put forward by the UK side that, you know, these were actually Russian state agents, and to not be able to counter that with anything clear, I think that's where the problem was. Does that make more sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, do we have any more questions from anyone in the audience at all? I think everyone's just stunned by your incredible presentations and convinced by your conclusions. So there are no holes at all in your presentations. I just wondered, oh, somebody's, yeah, Elizaveta would like to ask a question. Would you like to turn on your camera, or you don't have to turn on your camera, but would you like to?
No, that's all right.
Yeah, okay, oh great, hi.
Hi everybody.
Hi.
I'm a postdoc at Boston University, so I'm joining you from the US. I did my PhD at City University, so Aleksandra and I are colleagues. So I have two questions, one to Aleksandra and one to Precious and Lucy. So to Aleksandra, I have one question. If you could clarify, I didn't quite catch it. So what was the actual object of your analysis? Was it the online website of RT in English, or was it also online website of RT in Russian? And the other question I had, so basically following on that, do you look at the sort of differences? So you said that there are no, there are primarily Russian experts that are quoted and not international experts. And I did my analysis on RT UK and RT America. And I found that most of the times they were actually using experts from the Western country, primarily lefties or rather conservatives, so on the sort of far end of the spectrum. But I found that they were excessively using them both in the Syrian crisis and in the coverage of Crimea and Ukraine. So these are my questions to Aleksandra and to Lucy and Precious. I had a question, so I found it very interesting, both of your presentation, thank you very much. And I found it, yeah, exactly this insight about how RT strives in those environments of low information, particularly compelling. But I had one little, I don't know, skepticism sort of. So you mentioned that there is quite a difference between what US and UK Sputnik reported, or how they approached reporting of the poisoning. And I was wondering, so I actually did an interview of UK Sputnik, which used to be then the Voice of Russia, editors, and I found that their approach to like what they do and how they, first of all, they are primarily British, and they don't, so they're not even in any way affiliated with Russia, and they had a pretty unique outlook on what's their role there, and they didn't feel that they are actually there to justify Russian policies that much. So I wonder if this coordinated strategy between RT, Sputnik, Sputnik UK, Sputnik US, maybe a little bit exaggerated, in a sense that isn't there quite a bit of human editorial factor involved also in the way that they approach reporting even of such sensitive for Russia events. So yeah, that's my question.
Okay.
Shall I go first?
Yes, if you're ready.
Yes, so I looked at coverage both in Russian and in English, and because I wanted to include both Russian and English, I looked at website coverage, because RT doesn't really have a Russian broadcast operation. So, and then the second question was about experts, and actually, yes, I did find that there's a lot of Western experts as well. It's just in this particular paper, I'm just looking at Russian actors, and actually, what Lisa pointed out is very interesting, because I feel like with Russian experts, there is not as much division as with Western actors, where Western experts are almost always either on one or the other end of the spectrum. So they're either very left-wing or very right-wing, and and it's not as obvious when we're talking about Russian experts. Russian experts are mostly just academics providing sort of like pro-Russian, but not radical point of view, I guess, compared to Western experts. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, I just thought if you do consider it at all, because I find it also quite interesting how they use those foreign experts in a sense that they sort of use them to confirm a certain point and to maybe gain more credibility because they use somebody not Russian. And I thought that it could be a good comparison maybe, because you focus also on Russian experts, how they maybe use them together in one particular report, for example, to sort of strengthen the narrative. Yeah, that's all. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Elisabetta.
I'll answer the question just because it's yeah. So you made a good point, Lisa, about Голос России, Voice of Russia, which is Sputnik's predecessor, but actually the kind of change that the RT underwent from being Russia Today to RT, Sputnik kind of underwent a similar one in 2014. So if the RT one was very much predicated on the negative reaction that Russia and the sort of negative press that Russia received after the war in Georgia in 2008 in that summer, in the case of Sputnik reorientating its output, it was very much in the aftermath of the Ukraine crisis, and in 2014 it rebranded to become less a purveyor of soft power and more, again, like in the spirit of RT, commenting, offering a kind of Russian perspective on Western events. And obviously there is some commentary on Russian events, but so that I think in part answers that question. But when it comes to, we didn't have time to sort of specify, but when it comes to the web content, there's a lot of coordination. So I'm talking, you know, about the articles. And a lot of coordination between Sputnik and RT and RIA Novosti as well. Overwhelming amounts of, and you often see the same report just translated, you know, and tweeted on in 5 different formats across those platforms. But when it pertaining specifically to the Skripal affair and the different approaches to the interview, that refers very specifically to the radio coverage, which is Sputnik's kind of main medium. And of course, you know, there is an element of the human editorial factor, but I think it was very clear that the British journalists were embarrassed, and they were sort of, you know, more reluctant because it was much closer to home, whereas in the US, you know, it was much more distant, and therefore the coverage was much more sort of anecdotal. And, you know, essentially it wasn't an issue that was of great importance to American audiences. That's certainly how it seemed anyway from Sputnik's coverage. And what else do I want to add? Does that clear it up more or less?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it is a difference then if when you mean the online and radio, of course they are quite different in terms of the news agenda and stuff. I also noticed that actually Sputnik Online, they act primarily as a news agency that in a way sets the agenda for also other local Eastern European news media, and that they use Sputnik as a way like to source their news.
Yeah, they have,
I don't know if you...
Yeah, they've got a professional newswire that you can actually download as an app that is used by journalists in that region, yeah. But also I should just say, like when we say radio, now obviously it's become so digitized, I don't necessarily mean, you know, FM, AM radio, although in America they do actually have access to traditional airwaves in Kansas City and in Washington, DC. Now in the UK they don't, they're completely online. So it's more like a kind of podcast, a digital radio, and then radio one in the traditional sense. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Are there any more questions? I can't see any at the moment. Or are there any more questions from the presenters to each other? Or any other comments that anyone wants to make? Wondered if anyone wanted to say anything about the coverage of the Constitution. I realised that wasn't necessarily the topic of what you were talking about, but might be interesting to have your comments on that if you've been looking at it at all.
I've not been looking at it.
No, well, apart from in the way that everyone's been looking at it.
Yeah, exactly. I wouldn't want to give you a off the top of my head analysis.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, can we see any kind of particular narrative around that at all, which diverges domestically, you know, perhaps from, you know, a more international perspective? Just thought, as it had been in the news recently, whether anyone, and obviously, you know, is of major importance in terms of perception of Putin's legitimacy, whether anyone just by chance had been looking at this or thinking about it in terms of the topic today. No? But perhaps something interesting to talk about, or perhaps interesting to look at as a longer term project in terms of, you know, whether, you know, the extent to which perhaps, you know, those areas or regions that, you know, didn't completely support Putin, for example, you know, how were they covered? You know, were they covered? I don't know. But I guess we've, you know, maybe it's really early days to begin looking at that. Yeah, good. Okay. I think we've probably finished. We're going to conclude unless there's kind of last minute question on this. So all that remains really is to thank everybody for very interesting, insightful presentations.